A new story begins with heated events. One day, the world suddenly came to an end. The cause of this tragic event was a pandemic. The disease spared absolutely no one, and the largest group of infected people were people aged 20, 30 years. The chaos that occurred provoked a bloody war. The war, in turn, suffered huge losses. Economic collapse, food shortages. People were divided into two sides, with the hungry and the poor on one side and the rebels on the other. Ominous omens appeared, but the end was far away. Those who drove the last nail into the coffin of humanity were not the people themselves. They were sinister creatures that people didn't know about for a long time. These creatures have brought the end of humanity closer. Game characters have become such monsters. We are talking about terrifying monsters that scared every last human being. And what happened next was quite predictable. Superhumans appeared who joined forces and stood up for the defense of their country. Such people are probably everywhere, especially in novels. Using their abilities, they were really able to resist the attacking monsters. But the fact is that reality is always different from fiction. So in this situation, the superhumans weren't strong enough to put an end to the apocalypse. Fast forward to our main character, who was at home on the third day of the apocalypse. Without thinking about anything, he reached for his pack of chips and took out one. Then, without thinking twice, he popped it into his mouth. This young man knew that the world had not yet come to an end. That's why he still lived an ordinary life, carefree eating chips and drinking soda. But there was still something spoiling this sweet life. The complete loneliness of the dark-haired guy became a fly in the ointment. The young man lived alone in the apartment where he was staying. Its area was 100 square meters. Mom, dad, grandfather, and grandmother of the main character stayed outside. It is worth saying that the young man's father decided to buy this place. 200 million won borrowed from the bank was spent, and all the family's property, which amounted to the same amount. But there's a reason why the guy stays in this apartment, even though he wasn't born rich. This reason is that someone has to live here for 2 years before the family can receive a tax deduction from the purchase of. Then our main character will get rich. It was for this reason that he lived here. And now he was locked up by the sudden apocalypse. Looking at his mobile phone, the dark-haired guy just couldn't help but writhe in despair. All he saw on his screen was the same alert, which told him that he should reconnect and try to reconnect again. Having lost any hope of connecting to the network, the young man exhaled heavily. At that moment, a loud roar was heard from the street. Upon hearing it, the young man reluctantly raised his gaze, directing it out the window. In the clouds, he saw a terrifying winged monster that continued to roar deafeningly. Finally, the monster reached the panoramic window of the main character and, opening its mouth, showed its terrifying fangs. In surprise, the dark-haired guy jumped away from the window, falling to the floor. The monster outside the window was not going to retreat. When it flew into the guy's window with renewed force, the young man covered his face with his hands in fear. When the roar stopped, the hero fearfully opened his eyes. In front of him, he saw a blue plaque that told him that the subject who was not allowed to enter was trying to enter. Immediately after that, a new plaque appeared in front of the guy, which told him about the declaration of the Level 1 house, which states that no one can enter without the permission of the owner. Upon seeing her, the hero exhaled with relief, holding his hand over his heart. When he got to his feet, there was no longer a frightening entity in front of his face. Then, as he got closer to the table, the young man remembered that he was still alive only thanks to one thing. Catching himself, the hero ran to the door and pulled the handle. The door was still closed, which angered the guy. Looking at the gray door, the young man just exploded. Shouting loudly, he kicked the door with all his might. It was the third day since the world met its end. It was this system that protected the young man that irritated him. After all, thanks to it, he was locked up. The hero's evening was not idle, because he was just sitting on the floor, with his face buried in his hands, folded in his lap. At that moment, the system sent an alert that the Absolute could not leave the house. Looking at this motivating notification, the hero only wilted more. Clutching his head in despair, the young man realized that he couldn't do anything at all. Looking into the corner, the dark-haired hero realized something else. He has obvious problems with food, because there are only a couple of bags of instant noodles left. Yesterday, the electricity in the refrigerator was turned off. The main character survived on supplies from the refrigerator, but they wouldn't last long. Nervously gnawing his pollen, the young man thought about the remaining packets of noodles, but did not understand what to do next. At that moment, he heard the sounds of an alert and looked questioningly in the direction. In front of him, the young man again saw the blue table that informed him that he had killed Calican, thereby having gained a lot of experience. Looking at the table, the hero did not understand what it all meant. Then he decided to look out the window to make sure the system was true. On Earth, he saw a terrifying picture where goblins were devouring a monster that had recently tried to attack the hero. This sight, of course, did not impress the young man, but he realized that he had killed this monster because it crashed into his house. At this moment, the table was updated and notified the hero about getting a new skill. The mining nearby met the requirements, so the system started calculating mining. At this moment, the system made a beeping sound, as if indicating the beginning of the mining calculation. And the goblins who devoured the dead monster seemed to go mad. Their eyes lit up, and malicious grins appeared on their faces. To the hero who looked at this sight, it seemed as if the goblins had gone crazy. At that moment, they were no longer so joyful, because their heads were in severe pain. Immediately after that, the system made a repeated beeping sound, indicating that the prey count was completed. Then the table informed the hero that 22032411 had been credited to the account of the absolute recluse. The guy was looking at a table with a huge number, but did not understand what it meant. Suddenly, the room lit up with a bright light. Abruptly turning around and looking at the light bulb, the young man understood everything. The elixir has returned, and the declaration of the house has increased to the 3rd level. The system has issued a new alert about the new dignity preservation function of the 1st level, which means that half of the functions of the house will be restored to preserve the dignity of the hero. And the wallet of the absolute recluse was now at the maximum level, because the balance was 22032401. The young man looked at the notification and could not believe his eyes. Realizing that the functions of the house had been restored, he was over the moon with happiness. To make sure of this, the hero first rushed to the faucet. Opening it, the young man broke into a joyful smile. The water was coming from the faucet with a good pressure. Then the young man went to check the gas stove. Pressing the right button, the hero was finally convinced that a couple of minutes ago it seemed impossible. Now all the functions of the house were working as before, and everything was back to what it was before the end of the world. Then the guy hopefully grabbed his phone to see if he could get online. Unfortunately, there was the same notification on the phone asking him to reconnect to the network. Scratching his head desperately, the young man realized that his phone was still not working. But suddenly, he saw something on the floor that caught his attention. It was a flash drive lying next to a pile of crumpled pieces of paper. Without thinking twice, the guy picked up the flash drive and decided to take a look at what was on it. Sitting comfortably in an armchair, he turned on his computer and turned on the recording. The recording showed the main character's mother holding him in her arms when he was still very tiny. In the next frame, the young man was already older and was walking with his mother by the hand to school. Then the whole family appeared in the frame, consisting of the main character and his father and mother. Also on the video, the parents captured one of the guy's birthdays, where he blows out the candles on the cake. After watching the recording, the smile on the young man's face subsided. He sighed heavily, looked down, and his face darkened. Then he firmly decided that he had to bring his family here, no matter what it cost him. Getting up from his chair, the hero went to the window, and looking into the distance, he repeated again that he had to do it. At that moment, the hero heard the notification sounds again. After looking at the table, the hero read that he can now purchase goods in the store for the specified prices. He was greatly encouraged by this notification because his food was running out. And at that moment, the system issued another message asking to place the goods in the list. It was immediately followed by another alert asking if the hero wanted to make a list. The main character named Jaehyun was quite surprised when he looked at the notification that he could purchase items in the store for the specified prices. Carefully looking at the message, he thoughtfully put his hand to his chin and began to reflect. Without thinking twice, Jaehyun decided to click on the store's picture in the message. Pointing his finger at the right place, he saw a new notification about his balance, which was 22032391. The next message asked the hero if he wanted to make a list. Then the young man realized that if the system shows how much money he has, it means that it is connected to his wallet. After standing in front of the message for a short time, he went to the window and, without thinking twice, opened it a crack. In response to this action, the system issued a new message stating that the absolute recluse could not leave the house. Basically, Haehyun didn't expect anything else. Sighing heavily, he realized that he still couldn't leave the house, even though his skill level had increased a bit. But the guy still knew one thing for sure. This knowledge is related to the last event that happened to Jaehyun, when a feathered monster tried to attack his house. So, the young man was sure that if he hunted monsters, his level would rise, and he would get a new skill. And so Jaehyun planned to act until he knocked out the skill that would allow him to go outside. But the guy still had one question, because he still did not understand how he would fight monsters. Remembering how the feathered monster stupidly died after crashing into the glass, Jaehyun realized that such a situation was unlikely to happen again. Suddenly, looking down, Jaehyun noticed the goblins, who were still crowding around the carcass of the feathered monster. It was then that the young man realized that he could definitely defeat the goblins. The hero identified a plastic water bottle with the first projectile. Taking it in his hand and swinging it well, he prepared to throw it out the window in the hope of hitting one of the goblins. Without thinking twice, the hero threw the bottle out of the window with all his might. He was happy with his throw and hoped for a better result that would allow him to gain a new skill. Realizing that he could throw objects out of the window, Jaehyun was especially happy, and without thinking twice, he took up heavy artillery. They were dumbbells that he picked up from his floor, but suddenly, something happened that Jaehyun clearly didn't expect to see. The goblin commander-in-chief was giving his subordinates orders, and they, in turn, obeyed him and took apart the Calican piece by piece. They began not only to tear up the carcass, but also to leave with it in an unknown direction. That's exactly what Jaehyun didn't like, because his plan was to kill every last goblin. Therefore, before the goblins left, the hero decided to act by swinging his dumbbells. Then he threw her off the balcony with all his might. Desperately, the young man prayed that the dumbbell would hit any goblin, and the dumbbell, in turn, flew from the balcony with great speed because Jaehyun was on the top floor. But unfortunately, the direction was wrong and the dumbbell fell right on Calican's carcass. Hearing the loud fall of something heavy, the goblins turned around and looked questioningly at the carcass. And Jaehyun, looking at the whole picture, realized that he was finished. Looking at his second dumbbell, the young man realized that this was all he had left. The guy didn't know what to do yet, but he hoped that he had something else at home with which he could kill these damned goblins. Jaehyun understood that he certainly wasn't strong enough to throw a TV or a computer, so he immediately discarded these options. Suddenly, a loud goblin yell was heard from the street, which Jaehyun, of course, could not ignore. Looking down, he only saw the furious faces of the goblins staring straight at him. And the main one among these vile creatures threatened Jaehyun with his finger and held his dumbbell with his other hand. Realizing that the goblins were furious, Jaehyun was horrified. Sweat broke out on his face and his eyes were filled with fear. Meanwhile, the goblins continued to roar with all their might. Without thinking twice, they all immediately rushed to the building where Jaehyun lived. The hero, in turn, continued to watch the enraged monsters from the balcony, and suddenly, he realized that the rage of the goblins could play to his advantage, because from such a distance it would not be difficult for him to hit them. Then it dawned on Jaehyun. He quickly opened the store using the system and froze. The system in turn also asked Jaehyun to put the items on the list, and also showed the hero his balance. The young man reached for the list of goods. And when the guy was holding a dumbbell in his hands, the system asked him if he wanted to add this product to the list, to which Jaehyun firmly replied that he really wanted it. Then the system started adding the product. While the young man was holding a dumbbell, the system scanned it and seemed to copy it. A minute later, the system notified Jaehyun that the classic 3-kilogram non-slip dumbbell had been added to the list of products. Now the Absolute Recluse's store had a dumbbell worth 169901. Looking at the cost, the hero realized that the figure was the same as when buying online. Then it wasn't difficult for the guy to guess that the market price here was the same as it was before the end of the world. At that moment, the system asked Jaehyun if he wanted to buy 2 classic dumbbells. Without thinking twice, with a joyful smile on his face, Jaehyun said a jubilant yes. At that moment, a bright light poured out of the table, which the young man was so fascinated by. At the same moment, 2 dumbbells began to appear on his floor, which he was incredibly stunned by. Realizing that everything had worked, the hero was over the moon with happiness. He was glad that it made sense now, and he could continue attacking the goblins gathered below. Without thinking twice, he threw the dumbbell he had just bought off the balcony. The throw was good, because the dumbbell quickly landed exactly where the young man needed it. To be more precise, the dumbbell fell directly on the head of one of the goblins. Immediately, Jaehyun received a notification about the experience gained, and the 3,345 won earned from killing the goblin. Of course, the young man was very pleased with such news. Meanwhile, the goblins rushed to save their partner. Realizing that it was useless, they became even angrier and turned their gaze to Jaehyun's balcony. But Chaehyun didn't stop there and continued to throw dumbbells off the balcony, from which the goblins were forced to run away. Unfortunately, the young man's throw was unsuccessful, and the goblins simply scattered. Then he decided to buy another set of classic 3-kilogram non-slip dumbbells. Immediately after the purchase, the dumbbells reappeared in the guy's room as if by magic. Then, without thinking twice, Haehyun violently threw another dumbbell off the balcony. Fortunately, the dumbbell landed on the goblin's face. And when the system sent the notification of a 25-12-1 deposit and skill upgrade again, Chaehyun realized that he had managed to hit the goblin. The system also notified him about getting a new skill. There was no limit to the young man's joy. At that moment, he received a message about a new skill called storage, which is an alternate dimension used to store items. Seeing his new skill, the guy was amazed. Then he hurriedly opened the vault to send a dumbbell into it. When the vault was open, the young man brought his dumbbell to it. The system asked the hero if he wanted to put the presented item in the vault, to which Jaehyun confidently said yes. And when he released the dumbbell, the system took it away, delivering it to the vault. After that, the hero saw a notification that a classic non-slip dumbbell of 3 kilograms is stored. Also in the notification, the young man was asked if he wanted to summon this item, to which Jaehyun happily stated with burning eyes that he really wanted it. Then the dumbbell reappeared in the guy's hand. The guy really liked such machinations. Holding the dumbbell tightly in his hand, he realized that he could summon items from the vault to any location. That's when Haehyun came up with a brilliant idea that he was going to turn into reality. Within a couple of minutes, you could see the bright blue color on Haehyun's balcony from the street. Meanwhile, the hero just opened the vault. He put his hand out over the balcony and waited. Then, with a heavy sigh, he began to implement his plan. Thus, he began to summon dumbbells one by one. Dumbbells did not appear in the young man's hand, but already behind the balcony. A lot of dumbbells were flying down at high speed directly at the goblins. There were so many of them that it seemed that the goblins simply had no chance of survival. They just watched as a bunch of dumbbells flew towards them straight from the sky and didn't know what to do. Their commander-in-chief also couldn't budge and stood rooted to the spot. That's when Chaehyun's plan came true, and the goblins started dying one by one from the young man's dumbbells. All the hero did was receive notifications from the system about goblin kills. In the end, 54,661 were credited to the guy's account. And then the system asked if the hero wanted to add additional items. Looking at this notification with burning eyes, Chaehyun answered yes without hesitation. After opening the store, Chaehyun added 10 items. Now, the Absolute Recluse's store had a classic 3-kilogram non-slip dumbbell, a medium-sharp vat of ramen, a holy spring dish, rice, special eggs, easily digestible milk, yangbon olive seaweed, canola oil, and tomato ketchup. And the young man's balance now had 2178. 806 won. So the first thing the hero did was add dumbbells, which he used to defeat the goblins. In the background were all kinds of products and daily necessities, but suddenly, looking at his wallet, Jaehyun noticed one small detail. He now had 2178, 805 won on his balance. This means that the guy lost one war, but where did it go? Then Jaehyun wondered if saving a life was worth the money. In the end, he came to the conclusion that it wasn't worth it. Then the young man turned around and looked around the room. Without thinking twice, he suggested that the culprits for the loss of 1 could be bills for electricity, gas, and water, as well as a refrigerator. The fact that it was all too much trouble annoyed Haehyun, but he only blamed the goblins for everything, calling them various names. The thing is, after Jaehyun hunted goblins by throwing dumbbells at them, it was all over. The goblins just ran away and abandoned their former home. Since then, Jaehyun has only managed to kill a couple of nasty monsters. That is why the young man only dreamed of creatures that he could frighten. Looking out the window, he saw only the head of a feathered monster, which was left after the goblins. With disappointment, Jaehyun realized that there wasn't a single monster on the street. This means that he will have to find another way. The next period of time, the hero just stared at the sky and sighed languidly. He was wondering if he would be lucky if a dumb calican flew by. But suddenly, the hero saw something that amazed him. A familiar silhouette appeared in the sky, which rapidly continued to approach Jaehyun. Yes, it really was the calican that the young man already knew, which he had dreamed of so much. Seeing the monster, to his surprise, Jaehyun got scared and jumped away from the window, because he never expected that his wishes would come true so quickly. After coming to his senses, Jaehyun rushed deeper into the room, at the same time thanking God for sending a gift in the form of a monster. After a while, Jaehyun was ready to return to his cherished enemy. Putting the finishing touch, tying the rope tightly, the hero went to the balcony. With a rope, he tied the mirror to a drawing board, which he then dragged out onto the balcony. Seeing the light that the sun reflected from the mirror, Calican roared again. But Jaehyun wasn't going to run away, because it was part of his plan. Looking at the light and Jaehyun with his terrifying eyes, Calican prepared to attack. Without thinking twice, he rushed straight to the hero's balcony. Horrifyingly opening its mouth, the feathered monster tried to eat the guy. Jaehyun stood in the same place as if rooted to the spot, because he knew that nothing was threatening him. Of course, the monster wouldn't succeed, but Jaehyun's plan would work, which he was very happy about. At that time, Calican was already very close. Finally, he encountered a barrier preventing anyone from entering the house, which pushed him back. Jaehyun couldn't get enough of this sight, because at this rate, he would be in the bag. The young man has no doubt that he will definitely raise his level if he defeats this Calican. Meanwhile, Calican began to flap his powerful wings, sweeping away everything in his path, which Jaehyun clearly did not expect. Barely standing on his feet, the young man tried to wave off the stream of wind that was blowing the Calican with his wings. Opening his eyes, feeling that the wind had died down, Jaehyun was at a loss. After all, Calican was no longer in front of him. He seemed to have simply disappeared. But before the hero could come to his senses, he heard terrible noises coming from the roof of his balcony. Looking out, he saw how Calican had clawed at the building and settled on the roof of the balcony. Jaehyun was terrified and didn't know what to do. And Calican, in turn, did not even plan to retreat. Swinging his powerful beak, he tried to break the barrier of the house, in response to which the system issued a message stating that an unauthorized creature was trying to enter. But Calican didn't stop and continued trying to get inside the house using his beak. At that moment, Jaehyun was already starting to panic, and sweat broke out on his face. The young man began to doubt that he was safe, so he decided to act and opened a store. He knew he had to do something to protect himself and defeat Calican. After opening his store, the guy looked at all the goods he had again. Thinking about it, he realized that from what he had observed so far, prey counting only happens if the corpse is nearby. With this realization, Jaehyun continued to stare thoughtfully at the contents of his store. He understood that his goblin hunt was not successful. The thing is that some of the surviving goblins took the corpses of their dead brethren. Thus, the goblins that died were not counted as loot. In other words, if the distance exceeds a certain limit, loot counting simply does not occur. This fact made Jaehyun grit his teeth in rage. The hero understood that he simply could not allow this. Then, looking at how Calican was still trying to break into the house, Jaehyun wondered, is there a way to kill a monster with one hit? At that moment, the guy's gaze fell on a line in the notification with canola oil, which he had recently purchased. That's when Jaehyun's eyes opened wide, because it dawned on him. Without thinking twice, he began to buy 10 bottles of canola oil in a hurry. When the system asked the hero if he wanted to buy the product, he confidently said yes. Then, a few seconds later, there were 10 cans of butter in front of Jaehyun, which the system had given him. Grabbing all the jars of butter in his arms, the hero rushed to the kitchen. The first thing he did was grab a deep pot on the stove. Then the young man took a bottle of oil and, opening it, poured all the contents into a saucepan. Then, putting the pan on the stove, he turned it on to heat the oil. While the oil was heating up, the hero wrapped a towel around the stick and secured the whole thing with duct tape. Then, when the oil was hot, he put his design in a saucepan, thoroughly soaking it with oil. After that, the hero opened the store and grabbed a pot of hot oil by the handles. When the system asked the guy if he wanted to add this product to the list, he quickly and confidently replied, yes. And when the store was open, Jaehyun poured the contents of the pot right into it. Now, canola oil heated to a boil has been added to his list. After doing this, the guy's hand reached for a yellow lighter lying nearby. He picked up a lighter and held it to an oil-soaked towel wrapped around a stick. Immediately after this action, a high flame broke out. Jaehyun held a stick with a burning towel in his hand and watched. Meanwhile, Calican was still on the young man's balcony, not intending to fly away. Finally, the dark-haired youth returned to his opponent. But now he had a real weapon in his hands, which he had made himself. Fearlessly stepping out onto the balcony, Jaehyun loudly invoked the canola oil that he had previously poured from the pot directly into the store. At the same moment, a table appeared above Calican's head, and hot oil poured out of it. The oil poured directly onto Calican's head, causing the monster to roar loudly. But that wasn't the end for the treacherous monster, because Jaehyun was still holding a burning stick in his hand. Aiming straight at the opponent, Jaehyun shouted loudly. His eyes were full of madness and the desire to defeat the mad monster. That's why he threw his stick right at Calican's neck. In an instant, Calican burst into flames and roared in pain, and a malicious smile appeared on Haehyun's face, because his plan worked. Calican couldn't hold back anymore as the flames enveloped him completely. That was why he had no choice but to throw himself off the balcony and onto the ground. The hero looked at this enchanting picture and waited only for Calican to die. Meanwhile, Calican continued to suffer from the pain he was receiving and roared while lying on the ground. He couldn't do anything, so he just burned out. In this way, the young man successfully defeated Calican and gained a huge amount of experience. His skill level has also increased, and he has gained a new skill. Since the loot did not meet the requirements, the system started counting. After a couple of seconds, the loot count was completed. In the end, 9347481 were credited to Jaehyun's wallet. When the hero saw this figure, he couldn't believe his eyes at first. Realizing that his income was almost 10 million, Jaehyun tried to come to his senses. Suddenly, the system sent a strange new notification that all the requirements had been met. It was followed by another one, notifying that the expansion of the house's territory had begun. Before Jaehyun knew it, the support beneath his feet began to give way. He was trying to keep his balance, but he didn't understand what was going on. At that moment, the white of Jaehyun's eyes began to darken gradually. His perception of the world was different, as if he saw everything through an X-ray. Barely standing on his feet, the young man covered his face with his hands. He saw strange pictures that he would not have been able to see if he were in a normal state. The young man also saw a long corridor, at the end of which there was a window to the street. Finally, the hero was able to see something reasonable. It was a group of 4 people sitting at a table. When Jaehyun saw the people, he was really surprised. Without thinking twice, he realized that he had seen neighbors living in a house nearby. Clutching his head, Jaehyun tried to come to his senses. He didn't understand what was going on at all. He looked at the family, who looked extremely depressed. Admittedly, the hero was stunned when he saw the people. Finally, Jaehyun's eyes returned to their former selves. The darkness seemed to disappear, and the hero found himself back in a bright room. Trembling with fear and misunderstanding of what had happened, Jaehyun tried to comprehend what had happened. At that moment, the system gave the hero a photo of a man named Choi Hyun-jun, who was over 30 years old. He was followed by his wife named Park Hyeon, who was over 30 years old. Next, Jaehyun saw a girl he already knew with her tail on one side. Her name is Choi Na-yeon, and she is the first child in this family, who is 6 years old. Her sister's name is Choi So-yeon, and she is the second child at the age of 3 years. After introducing these people, the system explained to Jaehyun that he had discovered creatures that meet the requirements for obtaining citizen status. Then a notification came asking if the hero wanted to grant citizenship to these people. Getting to his feet, Jaehyun moved closer to the table, notifying him. Standing opposite him, he asked what would happen if he did not grant these people citizenship. The system has notified that the creatures who have not received citizenship will be expelled from their homes. After that, a new notification came asking if Jaehyun was sure he didn't want to recognize these people as citizens. The hero thought about it, and sweat appeared on his cheek. He understood that if he did not give these people citizenship, they would all be threatened by monsters. That is why he instructed the system to give the family citizenship. Immediately after that, the young man received a message that Choi Hyun-jun, Park Hyeon, Choi Na-yeon, and Choi So-yeon would receive citizenship. Jaehyun stared at the blue chart reflected in his eyes and continued to ponder. He suddenly realized that he could have acquired other citizenship-related skills, so he would have preferred to test them. The first thing the young man learned about the skill called the absolute eye, which means that nothing in the house is hidden from his eyes. After learning this, Jaehyun turned to the system and asked if he had anything on citizenship. At that moment, a row called Citizenship Management appeared on the table. When the guy saw her, he immediately reached for her with his finger. By clicking on the line, Jaehyun received new information about the family he had just given citizenship to. But the hero's special attention was attracted by the line about 600 living people. It seemed to the hero that 600 people was too much. In the end, he decided not to dwell on it and look for information about Choi Hyun-jun. Her confidence level was 24. She had no awakened ability, and the experience distribution rate was 0, as was the money distribution rate. The guy's attention was drawn more to the lines and speeds of the distribution of experience and money. Without thinking twice, the guy decided that it was about what they would share with him, because he could even control how much he wanted. Breaking into a malicious smile, Jaehyun realized how he had to become stronger. Suddenly, Jaehyun's attention was attracted by a line called "Give a task." Without thinking twice, he clicked on it and received a description of the task, which consisted of a time limit, a reward, and a punishment for failure. Seeing that he could fill out the details of the quest, Jaehyun was really surprised. Taking advantage of the opportunity, Jaehyun decided to assign Hyunjun to hunt the goblin, limiting his time to 168 hours. Hyunjun's reward will be a small amount of experience, and there will be no punishment for failure at all. After filling out all the details of the quest, Jaehyun received a message asking if he really wanted to give this assignment. The guy thought about it, because there is a common reward here. In that case, how far can he go with the punishment for failure? That's why the young man decided to edit the punishment for failure by putting death. Now the details of the task looked different, because Hyunjun was going to die for not completing the task. When the system asked the hero again if he wanted to give this task, Jaehyun thought again. In the end, the dark-haired hero took pity and refused to issue the assignment. The request was canceled. Jaehyun desperately sat down on the floor and lowered his head. He realized that he could kill his citizens at any time if he wanted to. Thus, the murder of citizens in his area. But the thing was, Jaehyun didn't know what to do now. Suddenly, he thought about the skill called Absolute Eyes, which he had learned about earlier. Saying the name of the skill out loud, the young man plunged back into the darkness he had been in before. Now he saw everything again, even the family he had just met. Meanwhile, the drooping people were still sitting nearby and silent. Suddenly, the wife turned to her husband and asked, "What should they do now?" Her husband took his time with the answer and took a short pause before answering. Then he said that he needed to go out and at least get some water, because his wife would need to stay and wait here with the children. The man spoke with his head down, not looking at his wife, and she was immediately alarmed when she heard Hyunjun's answer. She claimed Hyunjun couldn't do it because it was too dangerous. Hyunjun replied that he knew it himself, but they simply had no other way out. Then the girl asked, "Is there water anywhere in principle?" Hyunjun explained that he wanted to try to go to the nearest store because it's quite big, so there must be something there. In fact, Hyunjun's face was incredibly sad and scared. At that moment, Soyeon's daughter said she was thirsty, so I turned to my father. The father could not answer his daughter, and the mother only called her by name. Then the father told his wife that he would definitely bring something, so she would have to wait for him here, because she trusted him. The wife only made a face and squeezed her eyes shut, because she was very worried about her husband. And at that moment, Jaehyun dispelled the skill called Absolute Eyes. When he came to his senses, he concluded from what he saw that the situation was much worse than he thought. After reopening the store, he clicked on the item list. Suddenly, the hero thought about how nice it would be if more things could be stored here. Then the young man opened the skill window. So all Jaehyun could do was purchase items in the store for the specified prices, use an alternative dimension, and maintain dignity. At that moment, Jaehyun broke into a joyful smile. The system also asked the hero if he really wanted to increase the skill level of the Absolute Recluse store. When the young man agreed, the blue frame lit up. In just a moment, the Absolute Recluse shop's skill level was 2, and the number of items on the list was doubled. A 10% discount is also applied to the prices of all items. Jaehyun liked this kind of news. He was happy with the promotion. In the end, he had 2 points left. He understood that he had to invest more in the store and maintain his dignity. After all, now he knows that he can meet even more citizens. That's why the hero decided to upgrade the Absolute Recluse's store to the 3rd level. Now the number of items that can be listed has been increased to 40. Jaehyun also got an item recovery feature. After learning about the function that can restore old items and turn them into new ones, the hero was very puzzled. In the end, he came to the conclusion that upgrading the store to the 3rd level was worth it. That's why Jaehyun decided to rush to open a store and purchase the goods, and the hero wanted to buy water and tangerines. After purchasing in the store, the dark-haired recluse decided to raise the level of his other skills. To begin with, he raised the skill level of maintaining the dignity of an absolute recluse. Then he decided to provide the neighbors with electricity and water, because he would be able to ask for a lot in return. Brilliant ideas were born in the young man instantly, because he continued to smile with a slight smile. The absolute recluse's dignity preservation skill was now at the 2nd level. As Jaehyun's level increased, he discovered a skill like registering vassals. After reading its name, the hero was puzzled. The fact is that he did not know who the vassals were. Meanwhile, Hyunjin was already standing by the door with his backpack packed to go on an outing for his family. His wife and children were seeing him off when suddenly, Hyeon called out to her husband. Hyunjin turned around and assured with a smile on his face that he would definitely return, and his wife and daughters would just need to protect the house while he was gone. At that moment, Soyeon and Nayeon, looking at their father with plaintive eyes, asked if he was really going to leave. The father explained that he was really going to go and bring food and water for the family, and the daughters would only need to listen to their mother. With these words, the father stroked his eldest daughter, whose tears were already running down her cheeks, on her head. Unable to stand it, the girl screamed loudly and hysterically that there were monsters outside. Fast forward to sometime earlier, when Choi's family was still unaware of the pandemic. When Soyeon and Nayeon were peacefully playing in the sandbox and humming different songs to themselves. But, unfortunately, their idyll was interrupted by the vile goblins. The girls were horrified when they saw the monsters because they definitely did not expect to see this. Reacting quickly, the girls began to run away from the evil goblins. Fortunately, the parents were nearby. Her father grabbed Soyeon's armpit, and Nayeon, who was terrified, took her mother under her wing. The family began to run away from the approaching monsters in unison. Of course, it was not easy for the family to remember these events, because then their whole world turned upside down. And now the girls burst into tears again, even though their mother tried to calm them down, but nothing came out. Hyunjin himself understood that he might be seeing his daughters and his beloved wife for the last time. Sweat broke out on the man's face and his lip was pursed. At that moment, there was a knock on the door. Upon hearing it, the family was very alarmed. When the knocking stopped, Hyunjin froze in place, staring at the front door. There was silence in the room and outside the door for a few more moments. Then there was a strange voice asking to open the door. That voice really scared Soyeon and Nayeon's father. Holding a self-defense stick in his hands, he didn't understand if it was a human voice. The man assumed that there might be a monster behind the door. At that moment, the voice asked again, "Is anyone at home?" Hyunjin stood ready and was afraid to move, and Nayeon and Soyeon covered their mouths with their hands so as not to scream in fear. Suddenly, footsteps were heard outside the door, and after a few minutes, everything went quiet. Hyunjin tentatively assumed that the stranger had left. The man understood that this needed to be checked somehow, so he began to approach the door. Opening the door wide, the man saw only a bright light. Hyunjin's eyes were filled with horror. The man was so scared and desperate that he rushed to his family and covered them with his back. Hugging his children and his wife, Hyunjin only wanted his family to be left alone. But suddenly, the family heard a familiar human voice asking them to excuse themselves. Hyunjin opened his eyes a crack and looked towards the front door in disbelief. Chaehyun stood in the doorway with a smile on his face and looked at the people sitting on the floor. Looking at Haehyun, Hyunjun was at a loss and didn't understand anything at all. While in the same position, the man asked Jaehyun who he was. Then Jaehyun finally decided to introduce himself, explaining that he just lives next door. The hero also handed the bags to the family, saying that they contained tangerines and water. With that, Chaehyun suggested that the family talk after they had a drink and a meal. Hyunjin looked at his wife with dumbfounded eyes because he simply could not believe what was happening. His daughters and wife looked back at him with the same surprised eyes. Hyunjin understood that he had no reason to refuse because the guest had water and food. He just hoped that Jaehyung would help them. That's why the man with the smile on his face worshipped Jaehyung first. Then he led him into the apartment, asking him to come through. When Haehyun entered the apartment, Soyeon and Nayeon began to observe closely. The hero looked at the girls in response and tried to look kind, laughing a little, but the young man understood that he had clearly scared the family with his abrupt visit. Haehyun also noticed the curtains blocking the light. He thought it was reasonable because it really reduces the chance of monsters attacking. While eating tangerines, Jaehyun began to look around the room. To begin with, the hero decided to provide his new friends with light, because this is the most important thing. Glancing at the chandelier with his gorgeous eyes, Chaehyun used a skill to light up the room. A moment later, the chandelier illuminated the entire room again, which the family was extremely surprised by. Jaehyun took out water from the bags and asked Hyunjin to give the children water first. The father took the water bottles from Jaehyung and handed them to his daughters. They, in turn, immediately opened the lids and began to greedily drink the contents. Soyeon even choked, hurrying to moisten her throat, so her mother asked her if she was okay. And Haehyun just watched what was happening and concluded that this family had clearly not seen water for a long time. Then the young man turned to Soyeon and asked the girl if she liked tangerines. Taking one piece out of the bag, the hero handed the tangerine to the girl, who took it with a displeased face and thanked the savior. Soyeon's mother offered her daughter to peel a tangerine, so the girl obediently gave the fruit to her mother. When the tangerine was peeled, my mother gave me one slice of soy. When Soyeon opened her mouth, her mom put a slice of tangerine on her tongue. After chewing a slice of tangerine, Soyeon experienced unimaginable feelings. Breaking into a sweet smile, the girl clutched her cheeks. Soyeon's mom smiled and asked her if it tasted good to her, to which the girl replied with a smile on her face, "Yes." At that moment, Hyun was approached by her second daughter, Nayeon, with a request to give her a mandarin too. After eating a slice, Nayeon was over the moon with happiness, and the system notified Chaehyun that the family had increased their trust in him. Soyeon's trust reached the 50 mark at all, because loyalty was unblocked, because it exceeded 30 units. Jaehyun will then receive a notification that Soyeon meets the requirements for registration as a vassal. Now the information about Soyeon has been changed, and Jaehyun has the opportunity to banish her. And while the family was chatting sweetly and smiling, the hero was hacking into the system to figure out who the vassals were. So Soyeon has fulfilled all the requirements so that she can be registered as a vassal. Although Jaehyun was very happy about this, he understood that this girl was too young for this. The guy also found out that unlike citizens, he can register only a dozen vassals. Thus, they should be at least at Choi Hyunjun's level and be able to follow Jaehyun's orders. But the thing is, Hyunjun's trust is only 31 units. Thus, Jaehyun needed Hyunjun to trust him more. At that moment, Hyunjun turned to Jaehyun so abruptly that the hero almost jumped up in his chair. Hyunjun, in turn, simply thanked Jaehyun for his kindness and assured him that he would like to repay him. In that case, Jaehyun suggested that the man go out and talk in private. Although Hyunju was a little surprised by such an offer, he couldn't refuse. Then the guys went out into the bright hallway to have a private conversation. Standing opposite each other, the guys were silent for a while. Then Jaehyun scratched his head and asked the other man if he had received citizenship. Hyunjun then showed Jaehyun the notification window for citizenship that he and his family had received 30 minutes ago. Then the hero asked if anything special had happened to him. Hyunjun replied that he and his family had not been able to move for some time. After listening to Hyunjun, Jaehyun suggested that the family was frozen until they received citizenship. After a moment of silence, during which Jaehyun reasoned, he turned back to Hyunjun. The hero stated that he was ready to help the Choi family return to the life they had before all this. These words stunned Hyunjun because he could not even imagine that once he and his family would return to normal life. Then Jaehyun explained that he could make sure that monsters would never invade the family's home again. After such a statement, Hyunjun was even more amazed, because he could not have imagined that such a thing was possible. But Jaehyun calmly assured that it was indeed possible. Hyunjun closed his eyes, calmed down, and fell silent. After standing like that for a couple of seconds, he opened his eyes again and asked what he needed to do, because he understood that all this was not for free. Before filling Hyunjun in on the details, Jaehyun warned him that he could lose his life. Hyunjun stopped talking then. Cold sweat broke out on his face, but without thinking twice, he firmly stated that he agreed to everything, because he owed Jaehyun everything. Hyunjun really wasn't afraid, because he had to go out for food and water before. He believed that he had already put his life on the line. Jaehyun liked these words, so he nodded his head in approval. Suddenly, Jaehyun remembered the golf club belonging to Hyunjun, so he asked how much it cost. Hyunjun was a little puzzled by this question, but after a little thought, he replied that the club was worth somewhere in the range of 500,000 won. Hearing the answer, Jaehyun wondered if the club was too expensive to add to the list, and now he needed to save money for the future. At that moment, Hyunjun asked the hero, why did he suddenly ask about the stick? Jaehyun assured him that it was nothing, and asked the other person to forget about it. After that, Jaehyun asked the man if he remembered the day the monsters appeared. Hyunjun really remembered everything, because these events happened not so long ago on the weekend. This topic of conversation made Hyunjun think of those terrifying goblins that attacked him and his family so unexpectedly. Going over all the memories in his head, Hyunjun wilted and assured that it really was terrible. Jaehyun agreed with the words of the interlocutor and added that he thinks those who stayed at home that day survived. So it's worth saying that one goblin doesn't have much power. Their level is also lower than that of an adult male. The real strength of freaks is that they always move in groups. But the same can be said about people who won't go into battle alone. That's why Jaehyun thought he needed to grow his own army first. Taking a short pause in the conversation to make sense of everything, Jaehyun turned back to his interlocutor. Then the hero stated that he wanted Hyunjun to search for survivors with him from now on. Jaehyun said these words looking Hyunjun straight in the eyes, putting his hand on his heart. The situation on the street was quite oppressive. The sky was tinged with red hues, as if the city had survived many fires. Jaehyun was at home at a time when Choi Hyunjun's trust increased. Lying on the couch, the young man looked at the blue window and began to run his finger over it. By choosing a graph with citizen management, Jaehyun once again looked at the trust of all the people he knew. In the end, the guy made the decision to continue to slowly accept people, because eventually, he will be able to meet with his family members. At that moment, unexpectedly for Jaehyun, the roar of monsters could be heard on the street. The hero worriedly jumped up from the sofa and instantly went out onto the balcony to see what was going on. What he saw shocked Jaehyun incredibly. After all, he saw people fighting goblins downstairs. Looking at these poor guys, Jaehyun immediately wanted to help them, but he realized that it would be difficult for him to do so. At that moment, the enraged goblins began to attack the group of daredevils. But their opponents were also not amiss, because one of the guys boldly rushed into battle. He punched one of the goblins with such force that the monster flew back several meters. Seeing such a trick from a human, the other goblins were of course stunned, but the mad guy didn't back down. Jaehyun, watching from the balcony, was as amazed as the goblins themselves, because he never expected to see such power from a human. At that moment, the next member of the group, holding a bow in her hands, got ready for battle. Pulling 2 arrows on the string, she attacked the goblins, hitting them right in the head. And the next band member decided to deal with the last monster with a bat in his hand. Jumping up high, he swung his bat straight at the dumbfounded goblin, who couldn't move. The big man was falling as if in slow motion, but even so, the monster could not escape its fate. Thanks to his muscles and power, the daredevil easily jumped on the goblin and struck him down. The impact was so powerful that the goblin was pinned to the ground. The rest of the goblins realized that things were bad with these guys and decided to escape immediately. And the team with superpowers continued to stand in the same place, watching the monsters scurry away. But suddenly, the red-haired girl with the bow noticed something behind her. Turning around quickly, she aimed her bow at the source of the danger. But there was nothing behind her, which surprised her a lot. She saw only a small ray. Without thinking twice, the girl raised her head and saw the light on the top floor. It was a joyful Jaehyun who was trying his best to attract the group's attention. The girl looked at the young man and did not understand what was happening, because it was easy to understand from her puzzled face. Meanwhile, Jaehyun continued waving his arms wide and shouting for attention. At that moment, there was a knock on the door and, turning around, the hero immediately realized who had come to him. Looking through the peephole to make sure, the guy saw Hyunjun, who he was waiting for. Opening the door to a man holding a large box, Hyunjun asked him to come in. Hyunjun, in turn, thanked the young man and began to enter his apartment. But before he could cross the threshold, the system prevented him from doing so Hyunjun just crashed into the void. It was clear from Jaehyun's puzzled face that he himself didn't understand what was going on. At that moment, he received a notification from the system that unqualified people could not enter the house. After reading this message, Hyunjun worriedly asked the guy what it meant. Jaehyun, in turn, looked at the blue window and thought, resting his chin on his hand. Suddenly, he suggested, could it be that no one could get to him? Jaehyun also assumed that only those who would be registered as a vassal could enter his apartment. Then the guy himself left the apartment to pick up the box from Hyunjun. Hyunjun explained that he had put everything that could be used as a weapon in this box. After thanking Hyunjun, Jaehyun began to open the box. The guy took out 2 knives and a toolbox from the box. He then opened the store and requested 5 bottles of water and 5 bags of instant noodles. Looking at how Jaehyun's request magically appeared in front of him, Hyunjun was simply shocked. After that, Jaehyun put everything he bought in a box and asked Hyunjung to go to the first floor and put the box at the entrance. Taking the box of water and food, Hyunjun tensed up a bit. It seemed to him that going to the first floor would be too dangerous. But Jaehyun asked Hyunjun not to worry and explained that after some observation, he found out that goblins are active only during the day. The fact is that Jaehyun had a special plan for that group of people who ruthlessly dealt with a bunch of goblins there. The young man believed that he had to win this team over to his side. The guy was sure that people would have no choice but to come to him when they realized that he had food. That's why Jaehyun explained to Hyunjun that he had a plan, and then asked him to carry the box again. Then the puzzled Hyunjun clarified, should he just leave the box on the first floor and come back? To which Jaehyun replied that he understood everything correctly. In that case, Hyunjin decided that it would be easy, so he calmed down a bit. After saying goodbye to Chaehyun and bowing in front of him, the family man was ready to go to work. And Chaehyun only thanked Hyunjin with a smile on his face. But before Hyunjin left, Jaehyun turned to his window because he felt it was necessary to do something for a guy like Hyunjin. After opening the task window, he showed it to Hyunjin so that he would understand everything. But when Hyunjin saw the window, he didn't understand anything, so he would ask Jaehyun about it, and Jaehyun explained that he would be able to gain experience if he completed the tasks. After hearing these words, Hyunjin compared this situation to something similar to leveling up in a game. Jaehyun explained to the man that he was really right and was currently at level 9. The guy also promised good rewards for raising the level, and also stated that he would count on him. Feeling responsible, Hyunjin stated that he understood everything. After this conversation, Hyunjin went on his first assignment. Glancing at the glowing exit sign, Hyunjin froze with the club in his hands. Without standing still for long, he set off on his way. Hyunjin descended lower and lower, starting from the 20th floor. After a while, he was already on the first floor. Boldly stepping outside, Hyunjin descended the steps and walked on. To be honest, the man was worried, but he tried not to show it. He understood that he just needed to put the box down, and that was it. But suddenly, Hyunjin heard some rustling to his left. Looking fearfully towards the source of the sound, the man saw silhouettes of people. But since Hyunjin had a rich imagination, he thought that it wasn't people standing next to him, but goblins. Terrified by his own thoughts, Hyunjin decided that he needed to run, but he hadn't even taken 2 steps when she let him down with a sharp squint. While falling, Hyunjin dropped the box containing food and water from his hands. The water bottles flew out of the box and scattered all over the path, and Hyunjin just lay on the ground and groaned for a couple more seconds. Suddenly, he realized that he couldn't move from fear. In a panic and with tears in his eyes, the man tried to force himself to move, but nothing happened. At that moment, he heard sounds from behind him and immediately thought that these were the goblins he had imagined. Terrified, Hyunjin rolled over onto his back and closed his eyes, waiting for the worst to happen. But suddenly, he heard a familiar human voice. So he opened his eyes and looked questioningly at the source of the sound. In front of Hyunjin was the same group of people that Jaehyung had been watching from the balcony, and they were all staring at the clumsy fat man in disbelief. While Hyunjin was recovering from his fall, Jaehyun received a notification that an unauthorized creature was trying to enter the house. Upon seeing this message, Jaehyun jumped up from the couch and stared out the window. He didn't understand what was going on for a couple of seconds. But then it dawned on him. Without thinking twice, he decided to use the proven method and visit Hyunjin with his skill. The young man's eyes darkened again, and darkness enveloped the area. So Jaehyun used the skill called Absolute Eyes again. Within a couple of seconds, he was standing invisibly among a crowd of daredevils who were being led somewhere by Hyunjin. At that moment, the team was having a conversation with each other. The girl was very surprised that they were being taken to an apartment building, from which someone threw a bag of noodles, and the dark-haired guy only hoped that there was food in this house. At this right moment, the blonde-haired man reminded his comrades that they were running out of rations. After seeing everything he needed to see, Jaehyun returned to his previous state, finding himself back at home. Barely standing on his feet after using the skill again, Jaehyun was lost. He realized that Hyunjin was with the very people he had been watching recently. And at that moment, the system notified the young man about the approach of creatures that meet the requirements for obtaining the status of citizens. Then there was a message asking if Jaehyun wanted to offer citizenship to these people. Looking at this notification, Jaehyun wondered if it was about offering citizenship. In the process of expanding his territory, Jaehyun could forcibly grant citizenship to those who were in it. But in this case, the outsiders are given a choice. So Jaehyun was a little confused, because if that's the case, they might reject his offer. That's exactly what Jaehyun didn't like, because he was trying his best to appropriate these people for himself. The guy understood that he needed to do something, but he didn't have any sensible thoughts yet. Suddenly, the doorbell rang. Hearing it, Jaehyun turned his head and stared at the device. For a few seconds, the young man stood outside, just staring at the intercom. But fortunately, he realized that it was most likely Hyunjin. When the hero came to the screen, Hyunjin appeared on it. Then the young man heard a man's voice asking him if he was here. Jaehyun in turn pressed the button on the intercom and asked Hyunjin to wait a bit. And while Hyunjin was waiting, Jaehyun decided to edit the assignment he was doing for him. Without thinking twice, the hero gave the system permission to edit the task. And when the system asked the hero to edit the task, a malicious smile appeared on his face. A few seconds later, he announced that Hyunjun would have to treat 6 guests. The system accepted the changes and updated Hyunjun's quest. After receiving the notification, Hyunjun inquiringly turned to Jaehyun, who explained in response that this was a new assignment. Jaehyun also asked Hyunjun to promise food to a group of people first. Jaehyun assured me that he had some ideas. Hyunjun understood all the instructions and invited the team into the house. At first, the guys couldn't enter because they had to become citizens first. Hyunjun informed Jaehyun that they were ready to enter, and the hero thanked the man in return. Then the guy told the system to offer all 6 guests citizenship. A second later, the system issued an alert stating that Jaehyun had offered citizenship to Ha Donggon, Kang Doks, Kim Gain, Yoo Hyerin, Kim Gong, and Moon Byung-ho. And when the group voluntarily agreed to citizenship, they were able to enter the house. The right of access to the 30th floor was granted to all these young people. Finally, the heroes entered and could go to Hyunjun's house. And the number of Jaehyun citizens has reached 10 people. The amount of experience and money earned by the young men's citizens increased by 10%. After seeing the bonus experience and money, Jaehyun was over the moon with happiness. He couldn't believe that he and his citizens would get such good buffs by going hunting monsters. That's why Jaehyun was ready to welcome new guests with open arms. In the meantime, the hero decided to look at the levels of his new citizens and their trust. Ha Donggon was level 23, which surprised Jaehyun a lot, because level 23 was the same strength as Calican, whom he killed. That's why Jaehyun wanted to find out more information about this Dong by opening his profile. In the profile, the young man discovered something interesting, which was an awakened ability called baseball throwing, which allows you to use stamina to increase the strength of the ball 3 times. This means that Donggon is superhuman, and a baseball can become a weapon at all, depending on who throws it. If the skill multiplies Donggon's power by 3 times, then it is ideal for killing monsters. And Jaehyun wasn't even worried about trust, because he could just slowly increase that value. Without thinking twice, Jaehyun asked the system to set the experience distribution coefficient for all 6 people to 70%. The system, in turn, completed the setup after a couple of minutes. Jaehyun was extremely pleased with himself. Now all he has to do is give these people monster hunting tasks, and Jaehyun himself will just sit and develop both experience and money. All this reminded the hero of auto-hunting in the game. Jaehyun, of course, understood that he needed to get to know the guests better when the time came. After all, they can be the key to reuniting him with his family. At that moment, the hero received a notification from the system that Donggon's trust had just increased. After seeing such news, the guy was stunned, because he hadn't done anything yet. But Donggon wasn't the only one who had increased trust in Jaehyun, as Gaeon and Hyerin also followed him. Jaehyun stared at the windows appearing and didn't understand what was going on. Meanwhile, Hyunjun was already inviting guests to his apartment. Worried, Hyun's wife ran up to her husband and asked, "What's going on?" Hyunjun replied that he would explain everything later, and also asked the girl to cook the food. Hywin was not happy with the task, because she had to do everything from scratch. But Hyunjun politely asked his wife and explained that Jaehyun had a plan. The girl thought for a while and agreed to cook everything. Then she turned to the guests and asked them to wait a bit. It is worth saying that a blonde-haired guy named Donggon overheard a conversation between a husband and wife. When Hywin went to the kitchen, he asked Hyunjun who Jaehyun was. When Hyunjun awkwardly replied that he didn't know the man himself, the guest was quite taken aback. Hyunjun continued to claim that he didn't know anything about Jaehyun except that they were neighbors. Hyunjun also added that Jaehyun is quite an intriguing personality. And while the guests were sitting down at the table, Hyunjun explained that it was all thanks to Jaehyun. Then the blonde, inquisitive guy thought again, concluding that Jaehyun was superhuman. Unbuttoning the lock on the jacket that had noodles in it, the young man thought that Jaehyun must have amazing abilities to be able to do all this. That's why the guest decided that he definitely had to impress Jaehyun. Donggun was confident that Jaehyun was someone who was powerful enough to provide electricity, food, and water. But the thing is, in the modern world, it's just a miracle, which means that Jaehyun is on a different level. At that moment, Hyunjun turned to the guests and explained to them that cooking would take some time, so they could take a shower for now. These words greatly impressed the 2 girls from the 6-person team. Meanwhile, Donggun realized that he could use most of the amenities in this house, as long as there was electricity. Hyunjun added with a smile on his face that he also had hot water in his apartment. These words stunned the 2 ladies even more, and the family man assured them that this was also part of Jaehyun's abilities. Hyunjun then told the guys that there was a bathroom in the living room and bedroom, so they could wash up two at a time. At that moment, a dark-eyed young man with glasses turned to the blonde guy and asked if he thought that Jaehyung was also superhuman, to which Donggun replied that it was likely, but Jaehyun's abilities were much more powerful than his own. At that moment, his dark-haired friend slapped him on the shoulder and, with a smile on his face, stated that they just needed to give a good beating. The blonde man didn't like these words, because he believed that they, on the contrary, should try to impress Jaehyun. These words from the mouth of a comrade surprised the dark-haired young man, and the enraged blonde guy asked his friend not to do anything and just keep quiet. He also decided to remind his friends that their goal is to get food, so they can't screw up. When the blonde-haired young man suggested that his comrades explore the room, they supported him. The dark-haired ringleader was especially pleased, but one guy in a light jacket stood aside all the time with his arms folded. When Donggun saw his face, his expression changed, as if he felt sorry for his partner. Approaching the shy Benho, Donggun put his hand on his shoulder, and he assured him in response that he had just listened to everything. Donggun confessed that he was very sorry and that what happened because of him, but Benho claimed that the blonde-haired young man had done nothing wrong. But Donggun kept saying that he was really sorry, because he was the one who invited his friends to the housewarming party. Benho continued to assure that everything was fine, looking away from his friend. Then Donggun suggested that the heroes have a snack, and then go to Grandma Benho. Although Benho agreed, the emotions on his face did not change. He was still in despair. The young man believed that it was too late to do anything. Closing his eyes, Benho remembered the terrifying eyes of the monster he had met. The vile goblins also couldn't get out of the young man's head. Thinking about his grandmother, Benho understood that the probability that his grandmother was still alive was 0, but he was just afraid to admit it. At that moment, Donggun assured Benho that they would definitely get to his grandmother and act together, because it was very close. So Benho just had to be patient a little. Benho agreed with his friend's suggestion, because he understood that he was doing all this only for his sake. The young men's conversation was interrupted by the creaking of the door. Turning around worriedly, they saw that the front door was ajar. Then a silhouette appeared in a small crack, clearly intending to enter. The perplexed Donggun didn't understand what was going on, so he was extremely worried. At that moment, a harmless Jaehyun entered the room with bags in his hands. After looking at the heroes, he declared that he was ready to help them all. Then Donggun relaxed and lowered his hand with the baseball. The boys looked at Jaehyun with caution, standing in one place as if spellbound. But Donggun understood that this man could save them from this pit of despair. After Jaehyun arrived, all the guys sat down at the same table. Haiwon apologized to the guests in advance for the closeness, laughing nervously. But Donggun insisted that everything was fine, because it was their fault for coming without warning. At that moment, Hyunjun came into the living room with a tray in his hands and informed the guys that they were going to eat now. When everyone had a portion, the hungry guys couldn't take their eyes off the delicious rice. Haewon scratched her head and admitted that she didn't know if the guys would like their food. So Hyunjun put a lot of goodies on the table, so the guys started to have dinner. The first thing the blonde girl did was reach for the dish in sight of the roll. Looking at him, she couldn't keep her mouth watering, so she hurried to try it first. After eating one piece, the girl was shocked by the excellent taste, so she hurried to pounce on the rest of the dishes. And Haeyeon claimed that it was all thanks to the ingredients Jaehyun had given them. Otherwise, she would have been able to offer the guests only rice and tangerines. At that moment, Jaehyun received a notification that Haeyeon's trust had reached 50 units. Seeing him, the hero was amazed, because he could not have imagined that Haeyeon's trust would increase faster than her husband's trust. Finally, all the guests thanked the host for the food and began to have a hearty dinner. A group of 6 friends were the most excited to have a snack, because they hadn't eaten a proper meal in a long time. None of the children refused the food and ate all the dishes with gusto. The blonde girl liked the egg roll the most. She couldn't get enough of it. And the second girl noticed that such a roll was served in Japanese restaurants. Haeyeon smiled and said that the guys were really right, and then asked them to enjoy their meal. At that moment, Hyun's daughter Soyeon came up to Hyun and said she wanted to try the roll too. Haeyeon patted the girl on the head and assured her that she would make her a roll after the guests had lunch. Seeing that Soyeon had tears welling up from these words, the blonde girl invited the girl to eat the roll with her. Soyeon liked this suggestion so much that she ran to the girl as fast as she could. Then, sitting comfortably on her lap, Soyeon got ready to taste the delicious egg roll. Taking a piece of the roll with 2 chopsticks, the girl asked Soyeon to open her mouth. When Soyeon obediently opened her mouth, the girl put the roll directly on her tongue. Then Hyun felt a little ashamed, because these were their guests after all, and Soyeon clearly shouldn't have done that. At that moment, Jaehyun invited Hyun and Hyunjun to join them, and also enjoy delicious food. Hyun and Hyunjun looked at each other uncertainly and then agreed. Smiling with all 32 teeth, the family invited the guests to have dinner together. While all the guests were noisily snacking and talking among themselves, Jaehyun ate in silence. He only thought about how it had been a long time since he had managed to eat so well. Suddenly, the young man saw a separate packaged portion and a piece of paper on it, on which it was written that this dinner belonged to his son. Shoving another piece of the roll into his mouth, Jaehyun just hoped that everyone was safe. After a while, all the plates that had previously held food were empty. Soyeon went up to her mom and, rubbing her eyes with her hands, said she wanted to sleep. Hyun picked up her daughter and offered to go to bed. Meanwhile, Jaehyun and the others continued to sit at the table and talk about nothing. Suddenly, the hero interrupted the guests and asked them to end this conversation. Then he asked the boys why they couldn't go to Grandma's even though she was right next door. After hearing this question, Donggun explained that it was all because of the goblins. Jaehyun looked at Donggun and repeated what he had said. Then Donggun explained that, apparently you can hide in the underground parking lot. That's why the goblins decided to make the parking lot their base. While Jaehyun was thinking about what he said, Donggun added that they estimated there were at least a couple thousand goblins in that place. Then Jaehyun realized why goblins could enter here through the underground levels, because the absolute recluse's ability only works up to the 30th floor. At that moment, Donggun also added that he and his comrades saw that all the entrances to the apartments were connected to underground levels, so they did not dare to leave. Then Haehyun stated that as far as he remembers, there are other ways. Donggun agreed with the hero and explained that their original goal was to use the nearby road and get out. But the thing was, there was a monster that looked much more dangerous than the goblins. Hearing these words, Jaehyun was really startled because he didn't understand what kind of monster Donggun was talking about. And a blonde guy with a drooping look said that this monster looked like a wolf or a bear. Then, fortunately, the guys managed to escape, but it was only because the monster was fighting the goblins. Thus, while the monster was distracted, the guys quickly ran away. Then Jaehyun thought even harder. He was trying to figure out what kind of monster the guys were talking about. And Donggun, lowering his head, confessed that they didn't know exactly what kind of monster it was, because it was very dark in that place. And Jaehyun, in turn, said that they couldn't avoid these monsters forever, so they had to do something about it. Donggun agreed with Jaehyun, but he didn't like the fact that they had limits. Jaehyun calmly looked at Donggun and asked, "What limits are we talking about?" Then a blonde girl joined the conversation, who explained that they were using bows and throwing baseballs, but sooner or later it would just end. Then Jaehyun stated that he could solve this problem. Then he asked the guys to give him a look at their arrows and a baseball. Then Donggun immediately took the ball and the bow and arrow and handed the items to Jaehyun. Jaehyun, in turn, was going to put these items on his list of goods. Without thinking twice, he took the ball in his hand and brought it to the blue window. Then the young man took the bow that Donggun had given him from the table. At that moment, the system notified the hero that he needed to pay 153,000,001 to add a compound bow in good condition to the list of items. And when the system asked again if Jaehyun wanted to put the onion on the list, he confidently replied that he did. Then he looked at everyone present and asked if they could all use a bow. Without thinking twice, the guy decided to just buy 5 sets of bows and arrows. He assured that the guys can take the chance and practice with weapons if they don't know how to handle them, because from now on, they will all use them. At that moment, Jaehyun received a notification that the trust of Donggun, Gayeon, and Hyerin had increased. At that moment, Benho seemed to have a spark in his eyes again. The hero had a hope that they could work together with Jaehyun. In this case, Benho will be able to save his grandmother. At that moment, Jaehyun received a new message saying that Benho's trust had also increased significantly. After seeing the new sets of bows and arrows, the guys were amazed, because with them, the hunting speed will be much higher, and the guys will no longer need to put themselves in danger to get arrows. At this point, Jaehyun decided to slow down the guys' fervor, and stated that they needed to significantly reduce the number of goblins before they could continue. Donggun agreed with the hero and asked when they would start hunting monsters, to which Jaehyun stated with full confidence in his eyes that the goblin hunt would begin tomorrow. The young man assured them that the sooner they started, the better it would be for all of them. Then the guy said that tomorrow they would all save Benho's grandmother together. This statement brought Benho to life. His eyes shone, and a smile appeared on his face. At that moment, Donggun asked Jaehyun how they would pull it off, to which Jaehyun, with a smirk on his face, replied that they would use a bait strategy. After Jaehyun's confident statement, the guys caught the silence. They all just stared at the hero in silence. Donggun frowned and thought, and a girl in a purple jumpsuit sitting next to him suggested that it might not be so unrealistic. The dark-haired guy with glasses, on the other hand, believed that the main thing was for everything to work. At that moment, Jaehyun received a notification that Hyunjun had completed his task, which cost 30,000 won. Jaehyun looked at this message with a little surprise in his eyes. He suddenly realized what he had to spend the money on. This means that only thanks to the availability of money, the hero will be able to raise the level of citizens. But since there's no urgent need for that right now, Jaehyun decided that it's okay not to do it for now. Before Jaehyun knew it, he received another notification that Hyunjun's trust had increased and reached 50 units, so the loyalty was unlocked and exceeded 30 units. Then a window appeared notifying that all the conditions for registration as a vassal had been fulfilled. Then, a window with all the information about Hyunjun appeared in front of Jaehyun. Looking at Hyunjun's registration as a vassal, Jaehyun thought about it. But after a couple of seconds, Hyunjun felt strange, and some kind of light appeared around him. Frightened, the hero asked, "What is it that has just flashed?" In this way, Jaehyun only registered the first vassal, which Hyunjun became. Then the young man discovered such a function as summoning a vassal to the territory of the house, which can be applied again only after 2 hours. Now the information about Hyunjun was changed, because now he was the first servant whose awakened ability was called Gorilla Power. This ability means that the owner gets a power equal to that of a gorilla. And the rank of first servant means that the experience and money gained from killing a monster are doubled, and the skill called Absolute Eyes can be used within a radius of 5 meters from the house. While Jaehyun was sorting out Hyunjun's new settings, he discovered another interesting button. By clicking on it, Jaehyun received a notification asking if he wanted to spend 1 million won to raise Hyunjun's level. Seeing such a huge figure, Jaehyun was stunned. At that moment, Hyun noticed Jaehyun's strange behavior, so she asked if he was okay. But Jaehyun assured her with shaking hands that he was fine, and then asked the girl a counter question. At that moment, Hyunjun said that he was just overwhelmed with power, but he didn't understand whose handiwork it was. When Jaehyun confessed that he had done it, Hyunjun felt like he had become 10 years younger. From such good results, a malicious smile appeared on Jaehyun's face. Handing the bow and arrows to Hyunjun, Jaehyun stated that he would also take part in the operation this time. So citizens receive a bonus of 10% additional experience, and due to the dual citizen effect, Jaehyun will be able to gain even more experience. That's why Jaehyun asked Hyunjun to try to kill as many monsters as possible, to which Hyunjun hesitantly agreed. In response, Jaehyun smiled and stated that he believes in the brave Hyunjung. The next day, the guys all went to the first floor of the house together. Wandering through the dark, scary corridors, the dark-haired guy asked Donggon if they had to check the ground floor. After all, the young man had seen before that all the windows were broken, and it was difficult to say anything about his condition. But Donggun assured them that they still needed to check this floor because it was Jaehyun's assignment, and they had come here as a rescue team. So, Donggun's first task was to send all the survivors in this apartment building to the 30th floor. That is why the hero explained to his comrades that their goal in this operation is to attract and kill as many goblins as possible inside the house. In addition, Donggun added that they need to find at least one survivor. After learning all the details, the squad moved on, and Donggun decided to start with apartment number 101. Since the guys didn't know where they might run into the goblin, Donggun asked them all to be on their guard. When they reached 101 and 102 apartments, the guys split up. Someone went to apartment 101 with a dong, and someone went to 102 with a dark-haired guy with a bat. After taking a step into the apartment, Donggon immediately froze in the same place. His face was as black as a cloud, and there was terror in his eyes. When the other guys saw what happened inside the apartment, no one could hold on. The whole apartment was covered in blood, and there were corpses on the floor. Gritting his teeth, Donggun squeezed his eyes shut. In the end, he ordered the guys to get out of here. The rest of the group was in apartment 102 at the time. Their surroundings were the same as Donggon's. After seeing such a sight, Donggon realized that no one had a chance on the first floor. That is why it was decided to quickly go up to the second floor. A couple of minutes later, the group was already on the second floor. There were corpses scattered all over the corridor, and the walls were covered in blood. After seeing this picture, the guys did not even dare to walk around the floor. Disappointed, Donggon invited his friends to go up to the third floor. Finally, the guys were on the third floor. Everything was completely different here, because there were no corpses, and the floors were not stained with blood. Without thinking twice, Donggon knocked on the first apartment door with his fist and asked if anyone was there. The girls went to another door and also started knocking on it, hoping to find survivors. The dark-haired guys also did not stand still, but tried to find at least one living soul. Hyunjun was with Benho, and while knocking on the door with all his might, he was also waiting for someone to open the door for him. But unfortunately, all the guys eventually returned to Donggon with frowning faces. It wasn't hard for Donggon to understand that his companions hadn't found anyone. That's why the guys went up one more floor. After knocking on the first door he saw, Donggon asked if anyone was there, calling himself the rescue squad. Suddenly, the door that the young man was knocking on opened a crack. A thin male face appeared from there. The first thing the survivor asked the guys was, "Are they really from the rescue team?" With a smile on his face, Donggon assured them that they were indeed a rescue team. In response, the man, still communicating with the heroes through the crack in the door, asked if they could give him some water, justifying this by saying that his throat was dry. Donggon reached into his bag and took out one bottle of water. He held it out to the man, who stuck his hand out through the crack, asking him to take it. Without taking a single sip, the man opened the door wider and asked again, "Are the guys really rescuers?" Donggon explained that they actually live in this house, but it's also true that they came to rescue the survivor. The young man assured them that they knew a safer place, so the man should go with them. Immediately after these words, the man slammed the door in front of the guys, and after a couple of seconds, he opened it again, but already wide open. Behind the dark-haired, unshaven man, the boys saw two more people, a girl and a guy. The guy stood there for a few seconds, peering into the faces of strangers. First of all, a man named Jones admitted that it was difficult for him to get rid of his suspicions. He then extended his hand to Donggon and told him his name. Donggon smiled in response, shook Jones's hand, and gave his name. After that, the young man asked Guyon and Hiren to take these people to the 30th floor and come back. When he found out that the guys weren't going to the first floor, Jones got flustered. At that moment, a dark-haired guy with similar facial features to Jones came out of the apartment. He was relieved to say that he could live now. The young man believed that a helicopter had arrived for him and his family. Hiren hurried to explain to the guy that there was no plane, but if strangers went up with them, they could take a shower and eat hot food. Hearing the words about the shower, the dark-haired girl, who had previously been in Jones's apartment, sparkled with happiness. Hiren assured me that there really is a shower and even with hot water. Then, without a second thought, the dark-haired stranger rushed down the corridor. Pausing for a second, she asked her father why he was standing, because they had to go upstairs. Suddenly, Jones realized that he knew these guys. At that moment, Jaehyun received a notification that the number of citizens had reached 40. Also, the experience and money earned by citizens have been increased by 90%. Thus, the number of citizens has increased to 40. To begin with, Jaehyun decided to place the children and the elderly in Hyunjun's apartment, but the young people will have to stay in the hallway for a while. When the operation was over, Donggon reported the results to Jaehyun. The young man said that they had checked 29 floors, but apparently not all the residents were in the building from the beginning. Jaehyun listened to Donggon and praised him for his good work. The young man himself thought that Hyunjun's apartment was almost full, but it should be enough. At the same time, the hero used his skill called Absolute Eyes to check who was doing what. He was slowly sinking into darkness, and his eyes were darkening again. When the young man's eyes finally turned black, he could see again what no one else had seen. The first thing the hero did was check Benho, who was dismantling the furniture. Then he spied on Hyunjun and his friend, who were doing teamwork with the girls. At that moment, the girls were walking down the corridor with the material wrapped around their hands. Donggon and his friend were dragging a heavy canister up the stairs at the time. After checking on everyone, Jaehyun returned to reality. Donggon, who had been nearby all this time, was slightly shocked because he did not understand what had just happened. At that moment, Jaehyun announced that it was time to move on to the second stage called goblin hunting. The guys went out again with the same team as the first time. First of all, Donggon suggested that the comrades hold a briefing. The guy explained that their task is to lure out all the goblins that are hiding underground. The first thing Dongun wanted to do was start with the minus ground floor. That was the plan. The guys are divided into 2 teams and provoke monsters, but why destroy them? Then the same thing will be done with the second floor, where the goblins have also visited. While Dongun was explaining the plan of action, the dark-haired guy with glasses had one question that Dongun allowed him to ask. The young man asked what would happen if there were more goblins than they expected, because in that case, they would just get stuck on the minus first floor, especially if they had to move goblin corpses. At that moment, Hyren broke into the conversation and assured that she alone could deal with all the goblins. Dongun agreed with the girl, because now it would be impossible to stop her with so many arrows. At that moment, the guys heard some nasty noises and immediately turned sharply to the source. Behind them, they saw a hideous green goblin. They were clearly not in the mood to talk to their comrades, because their eyes were burning and their claws were ready to grab at someone. Without hesitating for a second, Hyren pulled the arrow back on the string and released it. The arrows flew straight at the goblins' heads, instantly hitting them. But one goblin was still firmly on his feet, and despite the fact that his kin were gone, he was not going to retreat. At that moment, Doksu rushed into the fight, holding his bat in his hands. With only one blow, the young man managed to decapitate the goblin. His body flew several meters away from the dark-haired mad guy. So, the first 3 goblins were successfully defeated. Then Kim Gon went up to Dox and asked why they had brought the bow with them, because he said they needed it. Doksu turned on the dummy in response, and Hyeren pointed her finger at something to the guys, asking them to look at it. As it turned out, the girl noticed that the corpses of the monsters were disappearing. Looking at this painting, the surprised Benho assumed that this was one of Jaehyun's abilities. Meanwhile, Dongun invited his friends to go down to the minus first floor. Benho liked that Jaehyun had a solution for all cases. That's why he liked him. At that moment, Jaehyun received a notification that the trust of Dongun, Gaeon, and Hyeren had increased. Meanwhile, Jaehyun himself sat in his room as if nothing had happened and twisted the cap on the bottle. He just watched the guy's trust in him grow every second. Although Jaehyun didn't plan it, it turned out that he watched the group. Suddenly, the hero received an alert that Benho's trust had increased to 50. Thus, loyalty was unblocked, which exceeded 30 units, which means that all the conditions for registration as a vassal were fulfilled. Upon seeing such news, Jaehyun was very surprised, because only a few hours had passed since the start of the outing. Anyway, everything ended well. After all, the more vassals Jaehyun has, the faster he and his team will develop. After looking at the information about Benho, Jaehyun noticed that his loyalty is 88 units. Seeing such a figure, the hero was stunned at first. But then he thought that it was only good, but still not good. Breaking into a malicious smile, he reached out his hand to the window to register Benho as a vassal. Meanwhile, the group was already on the first floor of the house. The nasty screams of goblins could be heard from the corridors, which would not stop. At that moment, Benho suddenly lit up with a blue light. The rest of the guys were watching the fight at that time, completely oblivious to what was happening to their friend. In front of everyone was the fearless Doksu, who struck the goblins with his bat in an instant. The goblins simply didn't have the slightest chance of survival. Meanwhile, Benho continued to glow, which scared him a lot. He looked at his hands and did not understand what was happening to him. Finally, the guys turned around and noticed that something was wrong with their friend.